Escalating violence leaves Middle East on brink of war. American warship holed in terrorist bombing, 15 feared dead. Rescuers struggle as worst floods for decades hit south coast. Back home, managerless England face up to a difficult future.
From ITN, the ITV Nightly News with Dermot Monaghan.
Good evening. Israelis and Palestinians are on the brink of war tonight after a day of tit-for-tat violence in the Middle East. It all started when 2 Israeli soldiers were lynched. Israel retaliated with rocket attacks on the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The Palestinians call that a declaration of war. Both sides are ignoring international appeals to stop fighting and start negotiating. Our Middle East correspondent John Irvine reports.
From mid-afternoon until dusk, they attacked the Palestinian town of Ramallah. The Israelis called it a symbolic warning, and this was the provocation for it. This morning's murder of 2 Israeli soldiers inside the town's police station. The Palestinian security forces could not keep a lynch mob of their own people at bay. In a first-floor room, the soldiers were beaten to death. Their bodies were later dumped out of this window. The Israeli army responded swiftly, moving their tanks into firing positions on the outskirts of town. Above, the helicopter gunships began circling. Ramallah continues to be the hotbed on the West Bank. For days, the Palestinians have been attacking Israeli soldiers, but after today's events, it's the Arabs who fear Israeli retribution. And they were right to. Minutes later, a combat helicopter stooped and released a missile. The target was the police station where just hours earlier the 2 Israeli soldiers had been killed. Several Palestinians were injured in the attack. A few were lucky to escape death. This was the Israeli Prime Minister unleashing his war machine. On Monday night, Ehud Barak had withdrawn his ultimatum and threat of a crackdown, but clearly he felt the brutal killing of the 2 soldiers here was a step too far, justification for abandoning restraint. The Israelis chose other specific targets in Ramallah, including Yasser Arafat's West Bank headquarters and Palestinian television and radio stations. The Israelis said their broadcasts had been inflammatory. The attack helicopters were also over the Gaza Strip, the power base of the Arafat administration. Here, Palestinian television shows one missile landing in the harbour at Gaza City. Here, Palestinians reply with anti-aircraft fire. The Israelis have struck at the heart of the Palestinian Authority, which they accuse of not doing enough to end the violence that has blighted the Holy Land for 2 weeks now. Tonight, Ehud Barak went on state television and said that in Yasser Arafat he no longer had a partner for peace. The Palestinian chairman has been visiting some of those injured in today's attacks, and as he returned to his Gaza headquarters before a cheering crowd, he said his people would continue the march towards Jerusalem. John Irvine, ITN, Ramallah, on the West Bank.
And John Irvine joins me on the line now. So, John, today's events can't make a solution any easier to find.
No, Dermot, there's absolutely no sign of anybody here pulling back from the brink. Indeed, tonight, Israeli helicopters have again been firing on Palestinian positions, this time in the town of Hebron, which is another West Bank hotspot. Increasingly, this conflict is developing a life of its own, and once influential mediators like President Clinton, for example, all of a sudden appear helpless. They seem to have run out of ideas and can only beg both sides to stop. But as I say, tonight, they show absolutely no sign of doing so.
Well, that's tonight. How tense is tomorrow likely to be?
Well, tomorrow is a big prayer day for Muslims, and thousands of Palestinians are likely to attend prayers on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. For Muslims, it is the 3rd holiest place in the world. It is, however, also sacred to the Israelis, and they have sovereignty over it and are not prepared to give that up. The dispute over this small piece of Jerusalem is the core of the problem and the focus of some of the worst violence seen here since the War of 1967.
John, thanks a lot. 15 American sailors are feared dead tonight after a suspected terrorist attack on a US warship in Yemen. The explosion happened as the ship was refueling in the port of Aden. The Pentagon says suicide bombers were responsible. From Washington, here's James Mates.
The first pictures of the USS Cole, a massive hull 20 foot by 40 foot, blown in its port side, seawater flooding into the forward engine compartment. Amid their anger and sorrow for those dead and injured, the US authorities are thankful that an explosion of this force did not sink the Cole. If it had, the toll of 5 dead, 10 missing, 35 more injured could have been much worse. The wounded are in hospital in the Yemen today, visited by the country's president, Ali Abdullah Saleh. 5 are seriously hurt, many of the rest have been badly burned. These pictures are of the Cole leaving its home base before this mission. It was refueling on its way to the Gulf to enforce sanctions against Saddam Hussein. A rubber inflatable packed with explosives drew alongside, 2 suicide bombers making no attempt to get away. President Clinton flew immediately back to Washington on hearing the news. His words reflected his shock and anger.
If, as it now appears, this was an act of terrorism, it was a despicable and cowardly act. We will find out who was responsible and hold them accountable. If their intention was to deter us from our mission of promoting peace and security in the Middle East, they will fail utterly.
The 2 presidential candidates, whose debate last night was dominated by foreign policy issues, today echoed the administration's line.
I hope that we can gather enough intelligence to figure out who did the act and take the necessary action.
Whoever is responsible for something like this will be met with a full and forceful and effective retaliatory response from the United States of America.
No one is explicitly linking the attack with events in the West Bank, though that is on everyone's mind. It is one of the problems for the administration that here at home they're criticized for not doing enough to support Israel, whilst in the Arab world they're increasingly accused of taking Israel's side. James Mates, ITN, Washington.
Here, homeowners and businesses across the south of England are bracing themselves for more heavy flooding. In parts of Kent and East Sussex tonight, rescue teams are using lifeboats to evacuate people from their homes. It follows some of the worst floods for decades, as Adrian Britton reports.
It is the worst flood the people of this Sussex town can remember. And tonight they are filling whatever bags they have with sand to protect their homes against ruin. The rainwaters moved in rapidly on Lewis, leaving cars submerged and residents in need of rescue. The emergency services were swamped with calls from people awaiting evacuation. Trapped at work, staff at the town's brewery had to be rescued by the RNLI. But such is the force of the water that even this lifeboat crew had to cling onto a bridge for safety, as their raft was swept away and eventually sank, to the gasps of people watching nearby. One of the crew was left clinging on in the water until he was pulled to safety. Earlier, it was the picturesque town of Uckfield which experienced floodwater devastation. The River Uck burst its banks in the middle of the night. By morning, shopkeepers arrived to find their business stock ruined.
I was absolutely devastated. I couldn't believe it, to be honest with you.
Yesterday we put out at least 100 boxes of books, and to think of all those books and everything ruined, and looking through the window, it breaks your heart to see it all just in a tip on the floor.
With alarm bells ringing out over the damage, food in the Summerfield supermarket store was swept off the shelves and into the high street. The pavement railings held back some of the produce, but most was swept away into a mixture of floodwater and sewage. One man had to be rescued by helicopter after he was dragged away by the strong currents. He was airlifted to hospital suffering from the effects of hypothermia. Inflatable lifeboats were the only way to save many families trapped in their homes.
As soon as we launched, we virtually had a capsize. The boat was completely swamped, and we ended up actually inside a shop.
2 men spent 6 hours in their flat before a ladder and lifeboat men eventually came to their aid.
Been there since half-7, can't go to work, can't get out the back, car's flooded, so that's life, isn't it?
What's it feel like now to be rescued? Oh, great.
Looking for someone that's got a cup of tea and, yeah, a bit warmer, so.
It's estimated a third of businesses in Uckfield have been flooded. Many will be closed for several weeks for damage to be repaired.
It's an absolute catastrophe. It's caused millions of pounds worth of damage. It's wrecked several shops in the town centre, and I've never known conditions like this before in the town.
While some adapted to new methods of travel to beat the floods, others persevered with their usual transport. It is going to take many weeks to fully assess the damage. This evening in Uckfield, they began to clear up. But 5 miles downriver in Lewis, the immediate concern is one of safety, not cost. These residents, their pet dog and cat, were brought to land across what is usually a bustling high street. Evacuated, many are having to sleep tonight in the town hall. The slow wait now for the floods to subside.
The flooding will certainly get worse overnight. With high tide expected in the next 2 hours, that'll bring the water level up even further. And with the ground now saturated around this area, any amount of rainfall could result in flooding. Adrian Britton, ITN, Lewis.
And Juliet Bremner is in Lewis now. Juliet, what's the scene there tonight?
Well, not surprisingly, the people of Lewis are still very apprehensive. As you can probably see behind me, the water is now into the town centre itself. Police say it's not safe to go any further than the point where we are right now. But I suppose the good news is that they have been able to get to more than 100 people who were trapped in their homes. They've been taken to safety and are now at one of 2 emergency centres where they're being cared for. But the police are warning us that the electricity substation is now surrounded by water, so there could be widespread power cuts later on tonight.
And are people being given any idea when it's likely to improve?
Certainly it's likely to get worse before it gets better. We've said that several times, but high tide is coming at about midnight, so just under an hour's time. Waters could apparently rise between 3 and 4 feet. If that does happen, it's going to be many days before people can get back to their businesses, their homes, to assess just how much damage that there has been.
Juliet Bremner in Lewis, thanks a lot. The man accused of killing Jill Dando has been told he will stand trial. Barry George, also known as Barry Bulsara, will appear at the Old Bailey in a month's time. He's been remanded in custody until then. He's charged with murdering the television presenter at her home in London last April. The government is set to give insurance companies access to genetic test results for Huntington's disease from tomorrow. It means insurers could decide to make people who suffer from the brain illness pay higher premiums or turn them down altogether. It's feared that people with hereditary illnesses could be penalised. And the funeral of Scotland's First Minister Donald Dewar will take place in his home city of Glasgow next week. Thousands of people are expected to attend the ceremony in Glasgow Cathedral. Today, flags across the country flew at half-mast and books of condolence were opened. The English and Scottish football teams flew home from their World Cup matches today to very different receptions. Scotland, at the top of their group, have a real chance of qualifying. England, though, are staring failure in the face at the bottom of theirs. Here's our sports correspondent, Graham Miller.
England flew in from Finland, their confidence low and their hopes of qualifying for the next World Cup remote, despite the standing captain's optimism about the future. The goalless draw with Finland leaves managerless England bottom of Group 9, 5 points behind the Germans. The situation now is simple. Even to claim a playoff place, they can't afford to lose another game. But the FA won't be rushed into appointing their new coach.
We have a team of people of considerable experience around our chief executive. We are not going to be bounced into this decision, and I think most people, members of the public, will understand why that is.
One man who knows all about it, former coach Graham Taylor, receiving the Manager of the Month award for the 28th time. The Watford boss says expectations are too high.
You certainly have got to win in the vital games, the important games. There's no doubt about that. You can get away with the occasional loss in a friendly game, but when it comes to competitive games, people are not going to let you get away if you lose.
How England envy Scotland, their leading Group 6 consolidated with a draw in Croatia. Graham Miller, ITN Sport.
And tonight's main headlines again. There was a serious escalation in the violence in the Middle East today when Israel launched a wave of rocket attacks against Palestinian targets after 2 Israeli soldiers were murdered by a Palestinian mob. 15 American sailors are feared dead after a suspected terrorist attack on a US warship in the Yemen. Suicide bombers are being blamed. And parts of the south of England are braced for high tide tonight after some of the worst flooding there for years. Tonight's financial figures and the Middle East crisis has meant a volatile day on the world markets. In London, the FTSE 100 index went into free fall at one point, but it recovered to finish up 14 points. On Wall Street, though, the Dow Jones plummeted 379 points down. And the pound is trading more than 0.75% higher against the dollar. And now it's time to examine tomorrow's front pages. And like many of the papers, the Telegraph carries the grim picture of a jubilant Palestinian waving his blood-stained hands after helping to kill the 2 Israeli soldiers. It says the ensuing Israeli rocket attacks have brought the country to the brink of war. The Mirror has the same picture under the banner headline, Hands of War. The paper's correspondent describes seeing children dance for joy on the bonnet of the soldiers' torched car. The Daily Mail pictures the horrific moment when the body of one of the Israeli soldiers was thrown out of a window to the baying crowd below. The Guardian's photograph shows the impact of an Israeli missile on the police station where the lynchings took place. The paper says that after today's violence, hopes for peace in the Middle East were extinguished. And the Financial Times reports that the price of oil has soared to a 10-year high as markets react to the turmoil in the Middle East. And that's it for now. Do join me again tomorrow at 11 from the ITV Nightly News team tonight. Goodbye.
Hello, good evening. At the moment we've still got some showers around, mainly for coastal areas, but still 1 or 2 for Kent and Sussex with a possibility of flooding. Now during the course of the night these ought to fade away and we see clearing skies and what with light winds, tumbling temperatures down as low as 3 and some mist and fog patches, mainly for the Midlands, parts of the southeast as well as East Anglia. So we go into tomorrow morning and we see the places most likely to see showers being Northern Ireland, parts of Lancashire as well as western fringes of Scotland. Still the possibility of 1 or 2 showers for Kent and East Anglia there. Otherwise it's mainly dry, perhaps the odd isolated shower and certainly some sunshine coming through. So in the sunshine it ought to feel milder tomorrow, what with lighter winds as well, especially so out to the west. On the whole temperatures come in at the 13 mark or 55 in Fahrenheit. Quick look ahead now. On Saturday we see the rain into this sort of position. Behind it some showers and the breeze picking up. Ahead of it not too bad at all, basically better the further east you go. Come Sunday quite a bit of cloud, but certainly the best of the weather reserved for the southeast. And that's more or less the way we expect the weekend to work out. That's all from me.
Power Gen. Power whatever the weather.